Picture this: you're at your mother in law's 60th birthday dinner in Rome's most exclusive restaurant. 30 family members are seated at a magnificent table overlooking the Colosseum, but there's no chair for you. Your husband shrugs and says, "Oops, guess we miscounted." The entire family erupts in laughter. That moment, it wasn't an accident. It was the beginning of my revenge story that would bring down an empire worth $50 million. I'm Anna, and tonight I'm sharing how one missing chair changed everything. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far my tale has traveled across the world. I should have known something was wrong the moment I stepped into Villa Adriana that evening. The way the maitre d' avoided my eyes, the subtle shift in conversation when I approached the family gathering, the perfectly orchestrated seating arrangement that somehow mysteriously had no place for me. But let me start from the beginning because this story, my story, didn't begin that night in Rome. It started 5 years earlier on a rainy Tuesday in Boston when I first met Sean Caldwell at a coffee shop near Harvard Business School. I was 26, then running my own event planning startup from a cramped studio apartment in Cambridge. My company, Pinnacle Events, was barely breaking even, but I was determined to make it work. I'd grown up in a working-class family in South Boston. My father was a mechanic, my mother cleaned offices downtown. They'd scraped together every penny to help me get through business school, and I wasn't about to let their sacrifice go to waste. Sean walked into that coffee shop like he owned it. Designer coat, perfectly styled hair, the kind of confident smile that suggested he'd never heard the word no in his life. He was everything I thought I didn't want. Privileged, entitled, probably never worked a real day in his life. But when he struck up a conversation about the business plan I was reviewing, I found myself drawn in despite my better judgment. "Event planning, Schultz," he said, reading over my shoulder with a boldness that should have annoyed me but somehow didn't. "That's interesting. My family's in hospitality. Well, among other things." Other things turned out to be an understatement. The Caldwell family owned a network of luxury hotels across Europe, had investments in tech companies, real estate, and what Sean vaguely described as international ventures. Their wealth wasn't just old money, it was ancient money, the kind that traced back to railroad barons and oil tycoons. For 3 months, Sean pursued me with the persistence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted: expensive dinners, weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard, front row tickets to shows I'd only dreamed of seeing. I kept waiting for the catch, for the moment when his interest would fade once the novelty wore off. Instead, he proposed. We were on his family's yacht, because of course they had a yacht, anchored off Nantucket. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and Sean got down on one knee with a ring that probably cost more than my parents' house. The diamond caught the dying light like a captured star. "Anna Morgan," he said, his voice steady and sure, "you're the most extraordinary woman I've ever met. You're brilliant, driven, and you see the world in ways that constantly amaze me. Will you marry me?" I said yes. How could I not? I was head over heels in love, caught up in the fairy tale of it all. Poor girl from Southie marries the prince. It was the stuff of romance novels. The wedding was everything I'd never allowed myself to dream of. A sprawling celebration at the Caldwell estate in the Berkshires with 200 guests and orchestra and enough flowers to stock a botanical garden. My parents looked overwhelmed but proud, my father uncomfortable in his rented tuxedo but beaming as he walked me down the aisle. Eleanor Caldwell, Sean's mother, had insisted on planning everything. At the time, I thought it was generous, a mother-in-law wanting to welcome me into the family. I was too naive to recognize it for what it really was: the first subtle assertion of control, the establishment of a hierarchy where I would always be the outsider looking in. "Anna, darling," she'd said during one of our planning sessions, her voice carrying that particular brand of condescension that wealthy women perfect like an art form. "I know you have your own ideas, but trust me on this. We know how these things are done." I should have pushed back then, should have insisted on having a voice in my own wedding. Instead, I smiled and nodded, grateful for what I mistook as acceptance. The early days of our marriage were blissful, or at least they seemed that way. Sean and I moved into a penthouse in Back Bay, and I threw myself into growing my business. With my new connections through the Caldwell family Pinnacle events began landing bigger clients, more prestigious accounts. I was finally living the life I'd worked so hard to build. But success brought scrutiny, and scrutiny revealed cracks I'd been too blinded by love to notice. The first red flag should have been the family dinners. Every Sunday, without fail, we'd drive out to Eleanor's mansion in Wellesley. These weren't casual family gatherings. They were performances, elaborate productions where everyone played their assigned role. Sean's sister, Victoria, perfectly polished and married to a hedge fund manager. His brother Marcus being groomed to take over the family business. And then there was me, the interloper always seated at the far end of the table, always the last to be served. "Anna, dear," Eleanor would say, her smile never quite reaching her eyes, "how is your little business going? Still planning birthday parties and baby showers?" The dismissal in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. It didn't matter that I'd just organized a gala for the Boston Symphony Orchestra or coordinated a 3-day corporate retreat for a Fortune 500 company. To Eleanor, I would always be the working-class girl playing dress-up in her world. Sean never defended me. That hurt more than his mother's passive aggression. He'd sit there cutting his prime rib, nodding along as his family made subtle digs about my background, my business, my quaint parents who still lived in the same triple-decker where I'd grown up. "You're being too sensitive," well, he'd say later when I'd try to discuss it with him. "Mom doesn't mean anything by it. She's just protective of the family." Protective, as if I were some kind of threat. The second red flag was the money. Not the presence of it, but the way it was discussed, or rather not discussed. I'd grown up in a household where every dollar was accounted for, where financial transparency was a matter of survival. The Caldwells treated money like some mysterious force that simply existed, flowing in and out without explanation or oversight. I tried to understand the family business to take an interest in the empire I'd apparently married into. But every time I asked questions, I was met with vague responses and patronizing smiles. "Don't worry your pretty head about business, darling," Eleanor would say. "That's men's work, men's work." In 2019, I had an MBA from one of the most prestigious business schools in the country, but to Eleanor, I was just another pretty face who'd gotten lucky. The third red flag, the one that should have sent me running, was Vanessa Thornfield. I first heard her name at a charity auction about 6 months after Sean and I were married. We were bidding on a weekend in the Hamptons when Eleanor leaned over to whisper something to Victoria. I caught just 2 words, "like Vanessa." When I asked Sean about it later, his reaction was telling. The slightest pause, a flash of something in his eyes before he composed himself. "Vanessa. Oh, she's just someone from prep school. Ancient history." Ancient history that seemed to come up with surprising frequency. Vanessa had attended the same boarding school as Sean. Vanessa's father was on the board of some company the Caldwells were invested in. Vanessa had just returned from living in Paris and was looking for the right social circle to reintegrate into. I started paying attention, then really paying attention. I noticed how conversations would pause when I entered a room, how Eleanor's friends would exchange glances when they thought I wasn't looking. I noticed the way Sean's phone would buzz at odd hours, how he'd step away to take certain calls. But it was the overheard conversation that changed everything. It was a Thursday evening in late spring, about 2 years into our marriage. I'd come home early from a client meeting to find Sean on the phone in his study door, slightly ajar. His voice was low, intimate, in a way that made my stomach clench. I know," he was saying. "It's complicated right now, but you have to trust me. This is all temporary." I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Vanessa, listen to me," he continued, and my blood turned to ice. "The situation with Anna, it's not what I wanted either. But Mother has this whole plan worked out. The business connections, the image management, well, it's all strategic. Once we've stabilized the European expansion and dealt with the SEC investigation, we can revisit everything." SEC investigation, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. What SEC investigation? I love you. Sean continued, his voice soft with an affection I hadn't heard from him in months. I've always loved you. This marriage, it's just business, Van. You know that. Just business. I backed away from the door, my mind reeling. Everything, our courtship, our wedding, our life together, had it all been a lie? Was I nothing more than a convenient cover story, a business arrangement designed to make Sean look stable and committed while he waited for the right moment to be with the woman he actually loved? That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Sean slept peacefully beside me, his arm thrown casually across my waist like a claim of ownership. I thought about confronting him, demanding answers, but something held me back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the dawning realization that I was in deeper than I'd understood. If the Caldwells were under SEC investigation, if their business was in trouble, then my own company was at risk too. Half my clients came through family connections. My reputation was tied to theirs. If I made waves now, if I forced a confrontation, I could lose everything I'd worked to build. So I waited. I played the perfect wife, attending charity galas and family dinners, smiling and nodding while Eleanor made her subtle digs. I grew my business, building relationships that went beyond the Caldwell name. And I started paying attention to things I'd previously ignored, like the way Marcus would change the subject whenever I asked about the European hotels, like the mysterious trips Sean would take to Switzerland and the Cayman Islands, like the way Eleanor's designer handbags couldn't quite hide the tension lines around her eyes. The Caldwell empire, I began to realize, was built on quicksand. It took me 3 years to piece together the full picture, 3 years of careful observation, discreet research, and leveraging my event planning skills to network with people who had access to information I needed. Lawyers, accountants, business journalists, people talk at parties, especially when the wine is flowing and they think no one important is listening. The Caldwells weren't just wealthy, they were criminal. Money laundering through their European hotels' tax evasion schemes involving shell companies in offshore havens, bribes to foreign officials to secure development deals. The SEC investigation Sean had mentioned was just the tip of the iceberg. There were also inquiries from the IRS, Interpol, and several European regulatory agencies. And I was right in the middle of it all, married to the heir apparent, my business serving as an unwitting front for their operations. Some of my biggest events had been used to facilitate meetings between Caldwell associates and their criminal contacts. I'd organized dinners where bribes were exchanged, parties where money laundering operations were planned. I was an accessory whether I knew it or not. The smart thing would have been to run, divorce. Sean distanced myself from the family hope that my ignorance would be enough to keep me out of federal prison. But I'd never been one to take the smart path when the right path was more challenging. Besides, by then I knew about the plan. It was Eleanor's masterpiece, really. A carefully orchestrated strategy to use me as a scapegoat for their financial crimes while simultaneously clearing the way for Sean to marry Vanessa. They'd been planning it for over a year, waiting for the right moment to execute. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. They would frame me as the mastermind behind their money laundering operation, claiming that I'd used my event planning business to facilitate criminal transactions without their knowledge. They had documentation showing suspicious payments to Pinnacle Events correspondents that made it look like I was coordinating illegal activities. When the authorities came looking for answers, I would be the obvious culprit, the ambitious working-class girl who'd married above her station and gotten greedy. While I was facing federal charges, Sean would play the role of the devastated husband shocked and betrayed by his wife's criminal activities. He'd file for divorce, claiming he'd been an innocent victim of my manipulation. Then, after a respectable period of mourning for his destroyed marriage, he'd find comfort in the arms of his childhood sweetheart, Vanessa Thornfield. It was perfect. Almost. They'd underestimated me. See, growing up poor teaches you things that money can't buy. It teaches you to be observant, to notice when people are lying, to always have a backup plan. It teaches you that the only person you can truly rely on is yourself. While Eleanor and Sean were busy setting up their elaborate frame job, I was conducting my own investigation. I hired a private detective, not one from Boston's high-end firms that the Caldwells might have connections to, but a former cop from my old neighborhood who knew how to dig without being noticed. I also started documenting everything. Every suspicious conversation I overheard, every unusual transaction that crossed my desk, every piece of evidence that could prove my innocence and their guilt. I created multiple backup copies stored in locations they'd never think to look, and I started planning my own exit strategy. The beautiful thing about being underestimated is that no one sees you coming. Eleanor thought I was a simple-minded social climber too concerned with appearances to pose any real threat. Sean thought I was so in love with him that I'd never question his version of reality. They saw me as a pawn in their game, easily manipulated and ultimately disposable. They never considered that I might be playing a game of my own. By the time we boarded the plane for Eleanor's 60th birthday celebration in Rome, I had everything I needed: bank records, email correspondence, recorded conversations, witness statements, enough evidence to expose the entire Caldwell criminal enterprise and clear my own name. I even had proof of their plan to frame me, including drafts of the divorce papers Sean had already had prepared. Rome was supposed to be my destruction. Eleanor had planned the week-long celebration as the perfect setting for my public humiliation and expulsion from the family. She'd invited everyone who mattered in their social circle: business associates, family friends, potential investors who needed to see that the Caldwells were stable and respectable. The missing chair wasn't an oversight. It was theater. Eleanor had spent weeks planning that moment, coordinating with the restaurant staff to ensure that exactly 30 chairs would be set around the table for 31 family members. She wanted me to be forced to ask for accommodation, to literally beg for a place at the table in front of all their important guests. From there, the script would unfold predictably. I would be embarrassed and upset. Sean would be sympathetic but distant, already laying the groundwork for their narrative that our marriage was troubled. Over the course of the week, there would be more incidents, oversights, and misunderstandings that would make it clear I didn't belong. The week was supposed to culminate with Sean serving me with divorce papers at Eleanor's actual birthday party in front of 200 guests. He would cite irreconcilable differences and hint at financial irregularities in my business dealings. I would be publicly shamed, legally destroyed, and conveniently positioned to take the fall for their crimes. It might have worked too if I hadn't been 10 steps ahead of them. As I stood in that restaurant looking at the perfectly arranged table with no place for me, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. After 3 years of pretending, of playing the role of the grateful daughter-in-law, of swallowing Eleanor's condescension and Sean's betrayal, I was finally free to stop pretending. The family was already seated, chattering excitedly about their Italian adventure. Eleanor held court at the head of the table, resplendent in designer silk and enough diamonds to fund a small country. Sean sat to her right, handsome as ever in his perfectly tailored jacket. He looked up when I approached, and for just a moment I saw something flicker in his eyes: guilt maybe, or anticipation. "Anna," Eleanor's voice carried across the restaurant, bright and false as costume jewelry. "Oh my goodness, how embarrassing. It seems we've made a mistake with the reservation." The entire table turned to look at me, 30 faces wearing expressions that ranged from fake sympathy to barely concealed amusement. These people, Sean's cousins and business partners, Eleanor's society friends, the whole parasitic ecosystem that fed off Caldwell money, they were all in on it. They'd come to Rome not just for a birthday party, but for an execution. My execution. "Don't worry about it," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "I'm sure it's just an oversight." I let my gaze sweep the table, making eye contact with each of them in turn. These people who'd smiled to my face while plotting my downfall, who'd accepted my hospitality at events I'd planned while knowing they were participants in my destruction. Sean stood up, his movement casual, but his eyes sharp with calculation. "I'll talk to the maitre d'," he said. "I'm sure we can figure something out." But I was already moving, already implementing the plan I'd spent months perfecting. I pulled out my phone, the same device I'd used to document their crimes, and opened the app that would change everything. See, there's something Eleanor never bothered to learn about my little business. Pinnacle Events wasn't just about planning parties and coordinating catering. Over the 5 years since I'd married into the Caldwell family, I'd built it into something much more sophisticated. We didn't just plan events, we managed every aspect of luxury travel and entertainment for our high-end clients, including the Caldwell family. For Eleanor's 60th birthday week, I hadn't just booked their flights and hotel rooms. I'd coordinated everything: the private tours of the Vatican, the wine tastings in Tuscany, the yacht charter along the Amalfi Coast, the exclusive dinner reservations at Rome's most prestigious restaurants. Every single element of their Italian adventure had been arranged through my company, which meant I had the power to cancel all of it. Standing in that restaurant, surrounded by people who thought they were about to witness my public humiliation, I began systematically destroying their dream vacation. One tap on my phone screen, and their private villa rental in Tuscany was terminated. Another tap, and their yacht charter was canceled. The Vatican tour, the wine country excursions, the private shopping appointments, all of it vanished with the press of a button. But I saved the best for last. The restaurant where we were currently sitting about to enjoy what was supposed to be a triumphant dinner at my expense had been booked through my company. The deposit had been paid from my business account. The entire evening, wine, multi-course meal, private dining room overlooking the Colosseum, was in my name. I canceled that too. It took exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds to dismantle a week's worth of luxury travel arrangements. 4 minutes and 37 seconds to turn Eleanor's carefully orchestrated celebration into a complete disaster. I slipped my phone back into my purse and looked around the table one more time. They were still chattering, still reveling in what they thought was my embarrassment, completely unaware that their world was about to collapse around them. "You know what?" I said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I think I'll head back to the hotel. You all enjoy your dinner." I turned to walk away, then paused and looked back at Eleanor. For just a moment, I let my mask slip, let her see exactly what I thought of her and her little performance. "Oh, and Eleanor," I said, my voice sweet as honey and twice as deadly, "happy birthday. I hope this is a celebration you'll never forget." And then I walked out of that restaurant, my head held high, my shoulders straight, leaving behind 3 years of humiliation and betrayal. Behind me, I could hear the buzz of confused conversation, the first stirrings of concern as people began to realize something was wrong. By the time I reached the street, my phone was already ringing. The first call was from the villa rental company wanting to confirm the cancellation. The second was from the yacht charter service. The third was from the restaurant's maitre d' calling to verify that yes, the Caldwell dinner reservation had indeed been terminated, and they would need to settle their bill through alternative arrangements. I answered none of them. Instead, I walked through the ancient streets of Rome, past the illuminated monuments and bustling piazzas, feeling lighter than I had in years. Somewhere behind me, the Caldwell family was discovering that their week of luxury had just become a week of scrambling to find accommodations and transportation in one of the world's most expensive tourist destinations during peak season. But that was just the opening move. The real show was about to begin. The call started 20 minutes after I left the restaurant. First Sean, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Anna, what the hell did you do? The hotel is saying our reservations are canceled. There's some kind of mix-up with the bookings." I let it go to voicemail, savoring the tremor I could hear beneath his usual confidence. Then Victoria called, then Marcus, then Eleanor herself, her voice shrill with indignation as she demanded to know why their little arrangement with the restaurant had suddenly fallen through. I was sitting in a cafe near the Pantheon by then, nursing an espresso and watching tourists take photos in the golden evening light. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like myself again, not the carefully constructed version of Anna Caldwell who smiled through family dinners and deferred to her mother-in-law's wishes, but the original Anna Morgan who'd built a business from nothing and refused to back down from a fight. My phone buzzed with another call from Sean. This time I answered. "Hello, darling," I said, my voice sweet enough to rot teeth. "How's dinner going?" "Cut the act, Anna." His usual charm had evaporated completely. "I know you're behind this mess. The restaurant manager said you canceled everything through your company." "Did I? How careless of me." I took another sip of espresso, letting the silence stretch between us. "I suppose I must have gotten confused. After all, according to your mother, I'm just a working class girl who doesn't understand how these things are done." "This isn't funny. Do you have any idea what you've done? We have 30 people here expecting dinner, and now they're telling us we need to pay up front because our reservation was canceled." I could hear voices in the background growing louder and more agitated. Eleanor's shrill demands for an explanation, the restaurant staff trying to maintain their professional composure while dealing with increasingly irate customers who couldn't understand why their platinum credit cards were being declined. "That does sound awkward," I said, "though I'm sure someone as resourceful as your mother can figure something out. She is, after all, very good at making arrangements." "Anna, I'm warning me." I laughed, the sound carrying years of suppressed frustration. "Sean, honey, I think you're confused about who's in the position to make threats right now." I hung up and turned off my phone. Whatever chaos was unfolding back at the restaurant, I didn't need to witness it. I had more important things to do. My hotel room at the Hassler was everything the Caldwell accommodations weren't. Paid for with my own money, booked under my own name, completely independent of their rapidly crumbling arrangements. I'd made my reservation months ago, knowing I'd need a sanctuary when everything fell apart. What they didn't know was that canceling their vacation bookings had been just the warm-up act. The real performance was about to begin. I pulled out my laptop and opened the encrypted files I'd been compiling for over a year. Bank records showing suspicious transfers between Caldwell Hospitality and shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Email chains discussing consulting fees that were obviously bribes to European officials. Recorded conversations where Eleanor casually discussed tax avoidance strategies that crossed well into criminal territory. But the crown jewel was the evidence of their plan to frame me. 3 months ago, I discovered that Marcus had been creating false documentation linking my company to their money laundering operations. Purchase orders for event coordination services that corresponded exactly with known illegal transactions. Invoices for parties that never happened, payments for services that were actually bribes dressed up as legitimate business expenses. They'd been meticulous in their planning. I had to give them credit for that. Every document was expertly forged, every fake transaction designed to look plausible to investigators who didn't know the intimate details of my business operations. If I hadn't stumbled across Marcus's computer files during a family dinner where he'd foolishly left his laptop open in Eleanor's study, their frame job might have worked perfectly. Instead, it had given me everything I needed to destroy them. I opened a secure email and began typing. The first message went to Agent Sarah Chen at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, a contact I'd cultivated through a mutual friend who worked in white-collar defense. The second went to investigative journalist Rachel Martinez at the Boston Globe, who'd been sniffing around the Caldwell family's finances for months without getting the breakthrough she needed. The third email was the most satisfying. It went to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division along with detailed documentation of every offshore account, every suspicious transfer, every fraudulent tax filing the Caldwells had made over the past 5 years. But I wasn't done yet. My private investigator, Tony Rizzo, had been busy during the weeks leading up to our Rome trip. While I'd been playing the dutiful wife and daughter-in-law, he'd been gathering evidence that went far beyond financial crimes. Photos of Sean and Vanessa together, timestamps proving their affair had been ongoing throughout our entire marriage. hotel records showing regular meetings in cities where Sean claimed to be on business trips alone. More damaging were the recordings Tony had obtained through contacts in the hospitality industry, conversations between Eleanor and her inner circle discussing not just the plan to frame me, but their long-term strategy for rebuilding the family's reputation after my inevitable downfall. The girl was always temporary. Eleanor's voice was crystal clear on the audio file. Sean knows that. Once we've dealt with this SEC nonsense and pinned it all on her, he can marry properly. Vanessa understands the family business, knows how these things work. She won't ask uncomfortable questions like Anna does. What about the event planning company? This was Victoria's voice, always practical in her cruelty. It could be useful to maintain control of it, keep using it for our arrangements. Oh, we'll absorb it completely, some, Eleanor replied with casual confidence. Once Anna's in federal prison, her business assets will need to be liquidated to pay legal fees. We'll buy it through one of our subsidiaries for pennies on the dollar. Quite neat, really. They'd planned to take everything. Not just my marriage, not just my freedom, but my life's work. The company I'd built from nothing, the relationships I'd cultivated, the reputation I'd earned through years of meticulous effort. They intended to steal it all while I rotted in a federal penitentiary for crimes they'd committed. The recording continued with more details about their strategy, how they'd used their connections in law enforcement to ensure the investigation focused exclusively on me, how they'd leaked information to financial reporters to create a narrative about my suspicious business practices, how they'd already begun quietly distancing themselves from me in social circles, planting seeds of doubt about my character and competence. It was, I had to admit, a masterpiece of manipulation. If I'd been anyone else, someone without my particular background, my specific skill set, my intimate knowledge of how wealthy families protected their secrets, it would have worked flawlessly. But I wasn't anyone else. I was Anna Morgan from South Boston, and I'd learned a long time ago that when someone tries to destroy you, you don't just fight back. You obliterate them so completely that they never get the chance to try again. The evidence packages I sent that night contained everything: financial records that would trigger investigations across multiple federal agencies, audio recordings that proved conspiracy and fraud, documentation of bribes, tax evasion, and money laundering spanning over a decade, and most importantly, irrefutable proof that I'd been an unwitting victim of their schemes, not a willing participant. By the time the sun rose over Rome the next morning, law enforcement agencies in 3 countries had received comprehensive files that would keep them busy for years. The Caldwell empire, built on generations of careful corruption and protected by networks of wealth and influence, was about to collapse under the weight of its own crimes. But I still had one more move to make. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a simple black dress that conveyed both elegance and authority. My meeting was at 10 o'clock at the offices of Benedetti and Associates, one of Rome's most prestigious law firms. Alessandro Benedetti himself had agreed to see me, intrigued by the preliminary information I'd shared when scheduling the appointment. The law firm's offices occupied an entire floor of a historic palazzo near the Spanish Steps. Benedetti was exactly what I'd expected from his reputation: silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made him one of Europe's most feared litigation attorneys. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, rising from behind his massive mahogany desk. "Or should I say Ms. Morgan? I understand you prefer your maiden name for business purposes." "Anna is fine," I replied, settling into the leather chair across from him, "and thank you for seeing me on such short notice. Your preliminary materials were quite compelling, so," he said, his accent adding gravity to each word. "Though I must say, if even half of what you've documented is accurate, we're discussing one of the most extensive white-collar crime cases I've encountered." I opened my briefcase and placed a thick folder on his desk. "Everything's accurate. I have backups of every document, multiple copies stored in secure locations. The question is whether you're interested in representing me in what's about to become a very public legal battle." Benedetti opened the folder and began scanning the contents. His eyebrows rose incrementally as he worked through bank records, email printouts, and transcribed recordings. When he reached the section documenting the family's plan to frame me, he actually whistled softly. "This is extraordinary," he murmured. "The level of premeditation, the coordination across multiple entities. Mrs. Caldwell, if you'll forgive my bluntness, how did you obtain some of these materials?" "Carefully and legally," I replied. "I hired investigators, documented conversations I was party to, and accessed financial records for my own business that showed suspicious transactions. Everything was obtained through legitimate means." "And your husband? He's unaware of what you've discovered." I thought about Sean probably spending his morning dealing with the fallout from their canceled reservations while trying to figure out how much damage I'd actually done. "He's beginning to suspect, but he has no idea of the scope. None of them do." Benedetti closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "I'll be frank with you, Anna. This case will be expensive, complicated, and extremely public. The Caldwell family won't go down without a fight, and they have significant resources at their disposal. Are you prepared for what's coming?" "Mr. Benedetti," I said, meeting his gaze steadily. 3 years ago, I was a naive young woman who thought I'd married into a fairy tale. Yesterday, I discovered that my husband and his family planned to send me to federal prison to cover their own crimes. I'm not just prepared for what's coming. I'm looking forward to it. He smiled, then the expression of a predator recognizing a kindred spirit. "In that case, I believe we can do business together." We spent the next 2 hours going through the evidence in detail. Benedetti's questions were sharp and precise, testing the strength of my documentation and identifying potential weaknesses in the case. By the time we finished, he was convinced that not only could we prove my innocence, but we could likely recover substantial damages for the fraud and conspiracy I'd suffered. "There's one more thing," I said as our meeting concluded. "I want to file for divorce immediately here in Italy. I want it to be public, messy, and completely devastating to their reputation." "Italian divorce proceedings can be quite lengthy," he warned, "and if you're seeking to expose financial crimes, there may be advantages to pursuing the matter in American courts, where—" "I want it here," I interrupted. "In Rome, where they're all gathered for Eleanor's birthday celebration, where their friends and business associates can watch it unfold in real time. I want them to spend the rest of their vacation dealing with process servers and emergency legal meetings." Benedetti's smile widened. "I think I'm going to enjoy working with you." The papers were filed at 2 o'clock that afternoon. By European law, Sean would be officially served within 24 hours, along with notices that his assets were being frozen pending investigation of the financial crimes detailed in my filing. The Italian authorities, it turned out, took a very dim view of foreign nationals using their country's financial institutions for money laundering purposes. I spent the afternoon walking through Rome, visiting the places I dreamed of seeing when I was a young girl who thought travel was something that only happened to other people. The Vatican museums, the Sistine Chapel, the Forum ruins where ancient Romans had once conducted the business of empire. There was something poetic about walking through the remnants of another fallen civilization while orchestrating the destruction of the one that had tried to destroy me. My phone had been buzzing constantly throughout the day, but I'd kept it turned off, wanting to savor these few hours of peace before the real chaos began. When I finally powered it back on that evening, I had 47 missed calls and 63 text messages. The first voicemail was from Sean, recorded around noon. His voice was tight with stress, but still trying to maintain control. "Anna, I don't know what game you're playing, but you need to call me back immediately. We need to talk about this situation before it gets out of hand." The next message, sent an hour later, showed the first cracks in his composure. "The hotel is asking us to settle our bill immediately because of some issue with our credit cards. What did you do? Call me back right fucking now." By the fourth message, recorded late in the afternoon, he'd abandoned all pretense of calm. "You crazy bitch, what have you done? The police were here asking questions about our business arrangements. My mother is having a breakdown, and Marcus says there are federal agents calling our offices in Boston. You've lost your goddamn mind if you think you can get away with this. But it was the final message that told me everything I needed to know about how completely my plan had succeeded. This one was from Eleanor herself, her usual imperious tone replaced by something I'd never heard from her before: fear. Anna, dear, I think there's been some terrible misunderstanding. Perhaps we can sit down and discuss this rationally. I'm sure we can work out whatever difficulties you're experiencing. Please call me back so we can resolve this unpleasantness. Unpleasantness. 3 years of psychological abuse, a conspiracy to frame me for federal crimes, and a plan to steal my life's work, and she called it unpleasantness. I deleted all the messages without responding. They would find out soon enough that their attempts at damage control were far too little and much too late. That night, I treated myself to dinner at La Pergola Rome's only 3 Michelin-starred restaurant. I'd made the reservation months ago using my own name and my own credit card, knowing that by the time I used it, I would be celebrating something momentous. The view from the restaurant's terrace was spectacular. All of Rome spread out below me like a glittering jewel. As I worked my way through 7 exquisite courses, paired with wines that cost more than most people's monthly salary, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 years ago, I'd been so desperate to belong, so eager to be accepted by people who saw me as nothing more than a useful tool in their criminal enterprise. I'd swallowed my pride, ignored my instincts, and nearly let them destroy me in pursuit of a life that was never real to begin with. But somewhere along the way, I'd found my strength again. Maybe it was growing my business beyond anything the Caldwells could control. Maybe it was learning the truth about their crimes and realizing I had the power to expose them. Or maybe it was simply remembering who I'd been before I met Sean, a woman who didn't need anyone's permission to succeed. As I finished my wine and watched the lights of the eternal city twinkle below, my phone rang one more time. This call I answered. "Anna," Sean's voice was raw, desperate. "Please, just tell me what you want. Whatever this is about, we can fix it. You don't understand the forces you're dealing with here." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I replied, my voice calm and clear. "I understand that you never loved me. I understand that your entire family saw me as a disposable asset. I understand that you planned to frame me for your crimes and leave me to rot in federal prison while you married your childhood sweetheart." The silence on the other end stretched for nearly a minute. "How long have you known?" he finally whispered. "Long enough to document everything," I said. "Long enough to build a case that will send all of you to prison for the rest of your lives. Long enough to make sure that when this is over, the Caldwell name will be synonymous with fraud, corruption, and betrayal." "Anna, please." "It's too late for please, Sean. You made your choice 3 years ago when you decided I was expendable. Now you get to live with the consequences." I hung up and turned off my phone one final time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight in courtrooms and conference rooms around the world. But tonight was mine alone. As I walked back through the ancient streets of Rome, past couples strolling hand in hand and families gathering for late dinners, I thought about the missing chair that had started it all. Eleanor had intended it as the opening move in my destruction, a public humiliation that would set the stage for everything that followed. Instead, it had been my liberation, the moment when I stopped pretending to be someone I wasn't and started fighting for who I really was. The Caldwell empire was crumbling just as I'd planned. Within days, their assets would be frozen, their business licenses revoked, their reputations destroyed beyond repair. Sean would spend the next decade in federal prison if he was lucky. Eleanor would see her precious family name become a cautionary tale about the price of unchecked greed and arrogance. And I would be free, free to rebuild my life on my own terms, free to pursue relationships based on honesty rather than manipulation, free to use my talents for something more meaningful than facilitating the crimes of people who saw me as beneath them. The missing chair had been meant to put me in my place. Instead, it had shown me exactly where I belonged, not at their table begging for scraps of acceptance, but building my own table where everyone was welcome, and no one had to earn their seat through humiliation. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tonight, I celebrated the end of one life and the beginning of another. The morning brought chaos that even I hadn't fully anticipated. I woke to the sound of my hotel phone ringing at 6:30, followed immediately by urgent knocking at my door. When I opened it, I found Alessandro Benedetti standing in the hallway with 2 cups of espresso and a grim expression that somehow managed to look satisfied at the same time. "Good morning, Anna," he said, stepping into my suite without invitation. "I hope you slept well because today is going to be extraordinary." I accepted the coffee, gratefully noting that he was already fully dressed in what appeared to be his most expensive suit. "I take it the papers were served." "Oh, they were served," he said with the kind of smile that made opposing attorneys wake up in cold sweats. "At 4:30 this morning, to be precise. Italian process servers are wonderfully efficient when properly motivated." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be dozens of emails. "Your husband was served at the Hotel de Russi, where the family decamped after their villa rental was terminated. According to my contact, he answered the door in his underwear and immediately began shouting about diplomatic immunity." Diplomatic immunity. I almost choked on my espresso. For what? Apparently, he believes that being wealthy Americans grants them some form of special protection under international law. The process server found this quite amusing, as did the hotel's security personnel who were called to escort him back to his room when he attempted to follow the server into the lobby while still in his underwear. The mental image of Sean, always so concerned with appearances, making a public spectacle of himself in his briefs, was almost worth the 3 years of psychological torture I'd endured. Almost. What about the others? Eleanor was served at 7 o'clock sharp along with her morning cappuccino. I'm told she fainted. Victoria was served at the American Express office where she was attempting to resolve their credit card issues. Marcus proved more elusive. He appears to have checked out of his hotel around midnight and taken a flight to Switzerland. I raised an eyebrow. Running, attempting to. Unfortunately for him, Swiss authorities are quite cooperative when it comes to financial crimes investigation. He was detained at Zurich Airport 3 hours ago. The speed at which everything was moving was breathtaking. Less than 24 hours after I'd walked out of that restaurant, the entire Caldwell empire was crumbling in real time, but Benedetti wasn't finished with his updates. The real excitement, however, is happening in Boston. The FBI raided Caldwell Hospitality's offices at dawn. They've seized computers, financial records, and arrested 2 junior executives who apparently tried to shred documents when they saw federal agents approaching the building. He showed me his tablet screen, which displayed a breaking news alert from the Boston Globe. The headline read, "Federal Agents Raid Prominent Hospitality Company in Financial Crimes Probe." Below it was a photo of FBI agents carrying boxes of evidence out of the gleaming downtown office building where I'd attended so many family functions. Rachel Martinez broke the story at 6 a.m. Boston time, Benedetti continued. She had quite a bit of background information to work with thanks to an anonymous tip she received yesterday evening. I sipped my espresso, savoring both the rich flavor and the exquisite timing of everything unfolding exactly as I'd planned. How anonymous! Completely untraceable, I'm assured, though she did mention that the source provided remarkably detailed documentation, almost as if they had intimate knowledge of both the family's business operations and their personal relationships. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID showed my assistant back in Boston, probably wondering why her normally punctual boss hadn't checked in for 24 hours. I let it go to voicemail, but Benedetti gestured toward the device. "You might want to answer that. I suspect your business is about to become very busy." He was right. When I finally called Sarah back an hour later, she was practically vibrating with excitement and confusion. Anna, thank God I've been trying to reach you all morning. The phones haven't stopped ringing since the news broke about the Caldwells. Every reporter in Boston wants to interview you, and we've had 3 new client inquiries from people who specifically want to work with someone who isn't connected to the family anymore. What kind of inquiries? Big ones. The Morrison Foundation wants to discuss their annual gala. That tech CEO, Jennifer Liu, wants you to plan her wedding after seeing how you've handled this whole situation. And get this, the Attorney General's office called asking if you'd be available to consult on event security for some upcoming political functions. I felt a flutter of something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine professional excitement that had nothing to do with Caldwell money or connections. These were people who wanted to work with me because of my own reputation, my own skills. Sarah, I need you to clear my schedule for the next 2 weeks. Push everything non-essential and handle the media requests carefully. No interviews until I'm back in Boston, but you can issue a statement saying that I'm cooperating fully with all investigations and that Pinnacle Events operates with complete financial transparency. Already drafted and ready to go, she said with the efficiency that made her invaluable. Anna, I have to ask, did you really know about all this? About what they were doing? I knew they were criminals, I said carefully. I just didn't know how deep it went until I started digging. After ending the call, I found Benedetti watching me with an appraising expression. Your business instincts are excellent, he observed. Many people in your situation would be so focused on revenge that they'd forget to protect their professional interests. Revenge is satisfying, I replied, but financial independence is forever. He laughed, a rich sound that filled the hotel suite. I suspect you and I are going to work very well together. The rest of the morning was a blur of legal strategy sessions, media management and coordination with law enforcement agencies across 3 countries. Benedetti had assembled a team of Italian attorneys, American legal experts, and forensic accountants who were systematically dismantling every aspect of the Caldwell criminal enterprise. By noon, we had confirmation that federal investigators had uncovered the forged documents Marcus had created to frame me. The evidence was so obviously fabricated that it actually strengthened my position, demonstrating not just the family's criminal intent, but their spectacular incompetence in executing it. They made a crucial error, explained Dr. Patricia Hayes, the forensic accountant Benedetti had flown in from London. The fake invoices they created for your company contained transaction codes that didn't exist during the periods they claim the services were performed. It's like claiming you used a credit card that wasn't issued until 3 months after the supposed purchase. How did they miss something so basic? Arrogance, she said simply. They assumed no one would look closely enough to spot the inconsistencies. They also assumed you'd be too overwhelmed by legal troubles to mount an effective defense. But the most satisfying development came at 2 o'clock when Benedetti received a call from his contact at the Rome prosecutor's office. Eleanor had requested an emergency meeting, claiming she had information that could resolve the misunderstanding about her family's business practices. She wants to make a deal, he told me after ending the call. Apparently, she's willing to provide testimony about her son's activities in exchange for immunity. I felt a cold smile spread across my face. Is she now? The prosecutor was quite interested in my response. I told him that my client might be amenable to hearing what Mrs. Caldwell has to offer, provided she understands that any deal would require complete disclosure of all criminal activities and full restitution for damages. And what did he say to that? He said Mrs. Caldwell became quite pale and asked for time to consider her options. The afternoon brought news that Eleanor's options were rapidly disappearing. Swiss authorities had frozen Marcus's accounts and found evidence of additional money laundering operations involving luxury watch dealers and private art sales. Victoria had been arrested at Rome's airport, attempting to board a flight to Dubai with a suitcase containing €2 million in cash and jewelry. but it was the call from Agent Sarah Chen at 4 o'clock that provided the most dramatic update. Anna, I wanted to give you a heads up about tomorrow's developments, she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of an investigator who just cracked a major case. We've obtained warrants for the arrest of your husband and mother-in-law. The charges include conspiracy, money laundering, tax evasion, and obstruction of justice. When? Tomorrow morning Roman time, we're coordinating with Italian authorities for simultaneous arrests. Given the flight risk they've demonstrated, we're not taking any chances. I thought about Sean waking up tomorrow to find federal agents at his door the same way I'd woken up 3 years ago to find myself unknowingly married to a criminal. The symmetry was almost poetic. There's something else, Agent Chen continued. We found evidence that your business was being used as an unwitting front for their operations, but we also found clear proof that you were actively investigating their activities. The timeline shows you began documenting suspicious transactions almost immediately after discovering them. What does that mean for my company? It means Pinnacle Events is completely clear of any wrongdoing. In fact, your documentation has been instrumental in helping us understand the scope of their criminal enterprise. You may be called as a witness, but you're definitely a victim here, not a suspect. After ending the call, I sat in my hotel suite watching the sun set over Rome and reflecting on how completely the tables had turned. 24 hours ago, I'd been preparing for my own public destruction. Now I was orchestrating theirs. My phone rang again, and this time the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. Anna. It was Eleanor's voice, but stripped of all its usual imperial authority. She sounded older, smaller, desperate. Please, we need to talk. Do we? I know you're angry and you have every right to be, but this has gone far enough. You're destroying innocent people along with whatever grievances you have against Sean. I almost laughed at the audacity. Innocent people, Eleanor. I have recordings of you planning to frame me for federal crimes. I have documentation of your family's money laundering operations going back a decade. What part of that strikes you as innocent? You don't understand the position this puts us in. The business, the employees, the charitable foundations, all of it will be destroyed if you continue down this path. The way you plan to destroy me, her voice cracked slightly. That was Sean's idea. I went along with it because I thought it was the only way to protect the family, but I never wanted to hurt you personally. You never wanted to hurt me personally. I stood up and walked to the window looking out at the city where emperors had once ruled the known world before watching their empires crumble from internal corruption. Eleanor, you spent 3 years making it clear that I would never be good enough for your family. You orchestrated public humiliations, undermined my business relationships, and treated me like hired help at my own wedding. And that was before you decided to frame me for your crimes. I was protecting my sons. By destroying an innocent woman, yes, I understand exactly what you were doing. The silence stretched between us for nearly a minute before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. What do you want? Money? We can arrange a settlement that would set you up for life, a divorce that gives you everything you're asking for. Just please stop this investigation before it destroys everything we've built. What I want, I said slowly, savoring each word, is justice. I want you and your criminal sons to face the consequences of your actions. I want every penny you stole returned to the people you defrauded. And I want the world to know exactly what kind of people you really are. Anna, please. The missing chair was your idea, wasn't it? I interrupted. That perfect little piece of theater designed to humiliate me in front of everyone who mattered in your world. She didn't answer, but her breathing became labored. You wanted me to beg for a seat at your table, I continued, to make it clear to everyone that I didn't belong, that I was just a working-class girl who'd gotten lucky and was about to get what she deserved. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she whispered. No, it wasn't. You were supposed to destroy me quietly, efficiently, without giving me the chance to fight back. But you made one crucial mistake, Eleanor. You underestimated me. I hung up without waiting for her response. That evening, I had dinner alone at a small trattoria near my hotel, savoring simple Roman dishes while reviewing the messages that had been pouring in throughout the day. Reporters wanting interviews, lawyers offering representation, former clients expressing support and requesting meetings for future events. But the message that surprised me most came from Vanessa Thornfield. Anna, I know this is probably the last thing you want to hear right now, but I need you to know that I had no idea about their plan to frame you. I thought, I thought Sean was just going through a difficult marriage that would end naturally. I never would have been part of something like this if I'd known. I'm sorry. You deserve so much better than any of us gave you. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to process this unexpected piece of humanity from someone I'd cast as a villain in my own story. Maybe Vanessa really had been as manipulated as I was, just in a different way. Or maybe she was just smart enough to distance herself from the Caldwells before their ship finished sinking. Either way, it didn't change anything about what needed to happen next. The final call of the day came from Tony Rizzo, my private investigator checking in from Boston, where the FBI raids were still making headlines. "Anna, you beautiful genius," he said without preamble. "Do you have any idea how satisfying it is to watch these arrogant bastards get what's coming to them?" "I'm getting a pretty good idea," I replied. "The feds have been very appreciative of the evidence files we provided. Apparently, they've been trying to build a case against the Caldwells for 2 years, but could never get close enough to their inner circle to gather the proof they needed. And now they have enough evidence to convict them 10 times over. The recordings alone are going to put Eleanor away for 15 years minimum, and the financial documentation you gathered is so comprehensive that they're actually going to be able to recover money for victims going back to the family's earliest scams." I felt a deep satisfaction settle in my chest, not just because my tormentors were facing justice, but because their victims, people I'd never met who'd been cheated and defrauded over the years, would actually get some measure of restitution. "There's one more thing," Tony continued. "Word on the street is that several major Boston families are very interested in distancing themselves from the Caldwells right now. People who used to fight for invitations to Eleanor's parties are now claiming they barely knew the family." "Shocking," I said dryly. "The point is, your reputation is not just intact, it's actually enhanced by all this. People respect someone who stood up to corruption and won. Your business is going to be busier than ever." After we hung up, I sat on my hotel balcony with a glass of wine, watching the lights of Rome twinkle in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring the arrest, the media circus, the beginning of what would likely be years of legal proceedings. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, I felt completely at peace. I thought about the woman I'd been when I first walked into that coffee shop in Cambridge, young, ambitious, but also naive about how the world really worked. That woman had believed that love could overcome class differences, that good intentions were enough to build a life on, that people generally meant what they said and said what they meant. The woman sitting on this balcony in Rome knew better. She understood that power without accountability breeds corruption, that trust must be earned rather than assumed, and that sometimes the only way to protect yourself is to destroy those who would destroy you. But she also understood something the naive young woman hadn't, that real strength comes not from seeking approval from people who see you as beneath them, but from building a life so solid and independent that their opinion becomes irrelevant. Tomorrow, the Caldwell Empire would officially fall, but tonight, Anna Morgan was rising from its ashes, stronger and wiser than she'd ever been before. The missing chair had been meant to put me in my place. Instead, it had shown me that I didn't need their table at all. I was perfectly capable of building my own. The arrest happened exactly as Agent Chen had promised. I watched from my hotel balcony as unmarked cars surrounded the Hotel de Russie at dawn, their occupants moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. From my vantage point, 6 blocks away, I couldn't see the details, but my imagination filled in the gaps perfectly. Benedetti called me at 7:15 with a play-by-play that was better than anything I could have conjured. Your husband attempted to barricade himself in his bathroom, he reported with obvious relish. Hotel security had to provide a master key. When they finally extracted him, he was reportedly shouting something about this being a setup and demanding to speak to the American ambassador. And Eleanor, much more dignified, I'm told, she was already dressed and waiting in the lobby with her luggage as if she'd been expecting this moment, though I understand she did request permission to finish her cappuccino before being taken into custody. Even facing federal arrest, Eleanor couldn't resist one final display of aristocratic composure. I had to admire the commitment to performance, even as the curtain was falling on her entire world. They're being held at Regina Coeli Prison, pending extradition hearings, Benedetti continued. I've already filed motions to ensure the process moves as slowly as possible. Italian bureaucracy can be wonderfully inefficient when properly motivated. The news broke globally within hours. CNN, BBC, Financial Times. Every major outlet picked up the story of the American hotel dynasty brought down by financial crimes and family betrayal. The photos were particularly damaging, Sean in handcuffs looking haggard and desperate, Eleanor maintaining her dignity even as she was led away by Italian police. But it was the accompanying articles that truly destroyed them. Rachel Martinez's expose in the Boston Globe was devastating, laying out the full scope of their criminal enterprise with the kind of detail that could only come from someone with inside knowledge. She'd traced money laundering operations across 3 continents, documented bribes to officials in 12 countries, and exposed tax evasion schemes that had cheated governments out of millions in revenue. The human interest angle was equally damaging. Martinez had interviewed former employees who described a culture of fear and intimidation at Caldwell Hospitality, where asking uncomfortable questions could end careers overnight. She'd found suppliers who'd been systematically cheated, small business owners whose invoices had gone unpaid while the family lived in luxury. Most damaging of all was the sidebar story about me. Martinez had clearly done her homework, painting a picture of a hardworking entrepreneur who'd been systematically undermined by her wealthy in-laws before being targeted for destruction when she became inconvenient. The contrast was stark, them living off inherited wealth built on crime, me building something legitimate from nothing. My phone hadn't stopped ringing since the story broke. Sarah had fielded over 200 media requests, 36 potential client inquiries, and what seemed like every event planner in Boston calling to express solidarity and offer support. Anna, you need to see this, Sarah said during our afternoon check-in call. The Fairmont Hotel Group just called. They want to discuss replacing Caldwell Hospitality as their preferred event coordination partner for all New England properties. I felt my eyebrows rise. The Fairmont contract had been one of Caldwell Hospitality's most lucrative relationships, worth millions annually. For them to approach my much smaller company suggested just how toxic the Caldwell name had become. What did you tell them, Tom? That we'd be happy to discuss their needs once you return to Boston. But Anna, this is huge. If we land this contract, we'll need to expand significantly. New hires, bigger office space, probably multiple locations. The prospect should have been exciting, but I felt oddly detached from it all. Success built on someone else's downfall, even someone who deserved it, carried a complicated emotional weight. Set up preliminary meetings for next week, I told her. But make it clear that we'll need time to ensure we can handle the expanded scope without compromising our existing client relationships. Already on it. And Anna, the phone's been ringing with personal calls too. People wanting to know if you're okay, if you need anything. It's like the entire Boston business community has decided you're their hero. Hero. The word sat uncomfortably. Heroes fought for noble causes, sacrificed for others, put principle above personal gain. What I'd done was pure self-preservation, albeit executed with surgical precision. The uncomfortable truth was that I was enjoying the destruction more than I probably should have. every news report detailing another aspect of their criminal enterprise, every frozen asset, every former associate rushing to distance themselves from the family name. It all felt like validation for 3 years of swallowed pride and suppressed anger. Benedetti arrived at my hotel that evening with updates that pushed my conflicted feelings aside in favor of pure satisfaction. The Swiss have been remarkably cooperative, he reported, settling into one of the suite's leather chairs with a glass of wine. Marcus's accounts contained evidence of bribes to officials in 6 different countries. The amounts are staggering. We're talking about systematic corruption on an international scale. How systematic hotel development permits that should have taken years were approved in weeks. Environmental impact studies were falsified. Building safety inspections were bought outright. Your husband's family didn't just bend rules, Anna. They created their own reality where laws simply didn't apply to them. He pulled out his tablet and showed me a series of documents that made my blood run cold. Not because of their criminal implications, but because of how directly they implicated me. Several of the bribery payments had been disguised as payments to Pinnacle Events for consulting services. On paper, it looked like I'd been coordinating these illegal transactions, taking a cut of every bribe in exchange for providing logistics support. They were very thorough in setting up your fall, Benedetti observed, watching my face as I scrolled through the fabricated evidence. If you hadn't discovered their plan and documented the real timeline of events, this would have destroyed you completely. I thought about how close I'd come to walking blindly into their trap. If I hadn't overheard that phone conversation between Sean and Vanessa, if I hadn't started investigating on my own, I would have woken up one morning to federal agents at my door in a case that looked absolutely damning. There's something else, he continued. We've had an interesting development regarding Vanessa Thornfield. I looked up from the tablet. What kind of development? She's requested a meeting. Through her attorney, of course. Apparently, she has information about the family's activities that she's willing to share in exchange for immunity. What kind of information? The kind that comes from pillow talk with your husband over the past 5 years. His smile was predatory. It seems Ms. Thornfield was more observant during their affair than Sean realized. She kept records of their conversations, including several where he detailed specific criminal activities. The irony was exquisite. Sean had betrayed me with Vanessa, but in doing so, he'd also betrayed his family's secrets to a woman who was now prepared to use that knowledge against him. Are we taking the meeting? I thought we might. Her attorney suggests she has audio recordings of Sean discussing specific bribery amounts and money laundering procedures. She also claims to have information about additional criminal activities that haven't been discovered yet. I considered this carefully. Vanessa had been complicit in destroying my marriage, but she'd also reached out to apologize when the extent of the family's criminality became clear. If she genuinely had evidence that could ensure longer prison sentences for the people who tried to destroy me, refusing to hear her out would be cutting off my nose to spite my face. Set it up, I decided. But here in Rome, if she wants immunity, she can come to us. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon at Benedetti's law offices. Vanessa arrived looking nothing like the polished socialite I remembered from family photographs. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her designer clothing replaced by jeans and a plain sweater. She looked younger, more vulnerable, and completely terrified. "Anna," she said, as soon as she saw me, her voice breaking slightly, "I am so sorry. I know that's inadequate, but I need you to know that I had no idea what they were planning to do to you." I studied her face, looking for signs of deception. What I saw instead was genuine remorse mixed with fear and exhaustion. "Tell me what you know," I said simply. For the next 2 hours, Vanessa laid out a timeline of criminal activity that went far beyond what even my investigation had uncovered. Sean had been using their relationship as a confessional, boasting about the family's ability to manipulate legal systems and buy their way out of consequences. He thought it was impressive, she said, her voice hollow with disgust. The way they could make problems disappear, how they had judges and prosecutors in their pocket. He talked about it like it was some kind of game. She produced a series of audio recordings on her phone conversations where Sean detailed specific bribes, discussed which officials were reliable, and even laughed about how easy it was to manipulate regulatory agencies. But the most damaging recording was one where he explicitly discussed their plan to frame me. The beauty of it, Sean's voice was clear and confident on the recording, is that Anna's actually competent at her job. All those events she's planned for us, all those legitimate business relationships she's built, it makes the cover story completely believable. Who's going to question that she was skimming money from high-end client accounts? What happens to her? Vanessa's voice softer, less certain. Federal prison, probably 15 to 20 years if she doesn't take a plea deal. But that's not our problem. She should have stayed in her lane instead of trying to climb above her station. Listening to my husband casually discuss sending me to prison for crimes I hadn't committed, talking about it like it was just another business decision, crystallized something inside me. Any lingering doubts about the justice of what I was doing evaporated completely. There's more, Vanessa said, fast-forwarding through the recording. He talks about what happens after the divorce. Sean's voice filled the room again. Once she's out of the picture, we can move forward with our plans. The Swiss accounts will be clean, the European expansion can proceed, and we can get married without any complications. Mother's already planning the announcement for next Christmas. Next Christmas. They've been planning our entire future while sitting in my living room eating meals I'd prepared, accepting my hospitality while plotting my destruction. Benedetti was taking notes furiously, occasionally asking Vanessa to replace certain sections or clarify specific details. When we finished, he sat back in his chair with the expression of a prosecutor who'd just been handed a slam-dunk case. "This changes everything," he said. "With this evidence, we're not just looking at financial crimes anymore. This is conspiracy, criminal fraud, and attempted obstruction of justice. The sentences they're facing just tripled." Vanessa signed formal statements swearing to the authenticity of the recordings and agreeing to testify against the family in exchange for immunity. As she prepared to leave, she turned to me one final time. "I know this doesn't fix what I did to your marriage," she said, "but maybe it helps with everything else." "Why?" I asked. "Why did you record those conversations in the first place?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the Roman skyline. "Because I started to realize that if Sean could betray his wife so casually, if he could destroy someone who trusted him completely, then eventually he'd do the same thing to me. I wanted insurance." Smart woman. Smarter than I'd been, certainly. That evening I had dinner with my parents via video call, updating them on the situation while they sat in their familiar kitchen in South Boston. My mother looked worried despite my reassurances, while my father seemed torn between pride in my strength and concern about the toll all this was taking. "You sure you're okay, sweetheart?" Dad asked, his mechanic's hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had seen better decades. "This whole thing, it's a lot to handle on your own." "I'm not on my own," I assured him. "I have excellent legal representation, and the truth is finally coming out. What happens now?" Mom wanted to know. "When do you come home?" Home. The word carried complicated weight. My penthouse in Back Bay had been my home for 3 years, but it was also tainted by memories of Sean, of the life I'd thought we were building together. Going back there would mean confronting those ghosts every day. "Soon," I said. "There are a few more legal matters to resolve here, but then I'll be back to rebuild everything." "Rebuild?" Dad's eyebrows rose. "Honey, from what we're reading in the papers, your business is more successful than ever." He was right, of course. Pinnacle Events was thriving in ways I'd never imagined possible, but success built on the ashes of my marriage felt hollow somehow. I'd won the war, but the victory came at the cost of the naive optimism that had once made me believe in fairy tale endings. After ending the call, I walked out onto my hotel balcony and looked out at the city where Caesar had once ruled and fallen, where popes had built empires of faith and power that eventually crumbled under their own contradictions. Rome had seen countless rises and falls, witnessed the destruction of institutions that had seemed permanent, and the birth of new orders from their ruins. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Chen. Extradition approved, bringing them home tomorrow, thought you'd want to know. Tomorrow, Sean and Eleanor would be on a plane back to Boston, where they'd face justice in the same federal courthouse where I'd once feared I might be put on trial for their crimes. The symmetry was perfect, even if the satisfaction felt more complex than I'd expected. I thought about the missing chair that had started at all that moment of calculated humiliation that was supposed to begin my destruction. Instead, it had been my liberation. Eleanor had intended to make me feel small, unwanted, out of place in their world of privilege and entitlement. She'd succeeded in a way. I did feel out of place in their world, but rather than crushing me, that realization had freed me to build something better. The Anna Caldwell who'd walked into that restaurant 3 days ago had been desperate for acceptance, willing to endure abuse for the chance to belong somewhere she thought mattered. The Anna Morgan who would fly back to Boston tomorrow had no such illusions. She knew exactly who she was and what she was worth, and she didn't need anyone's permission to claim her place in the world. The Caldwell empire was finished. Eleanor would spend her remaining years in federal prison watching the family name become synonymous with corruption and betrayal. Sean would have decades to contemplate how his arrogance and cruelty had cost him everything he'd inherited and everyone who'd ever cared about him. And I would rebuild my life on my own terms, stronger and wiser than before, with a business that succeeded through merit rather than connections, relationships built on honesty rather than manipulation. The missing chair had been meant to put me in my place. Instead, it had shown me that I didn't need their table at all. Tomorrow, I would go home and start building my own. The flight back to Boston felt like traveling between two different lives. As the plane lifted off from Rome, I pressed my face to the window and watched the eternal city shrink below me, its ancient monuments becoming toy-sized reminders of empires that had risen and fallen long before the Caldwells had even existed. In just 5 days, I'd gone from being the humiliated wife at a family dinner to the woman who'd brought down a criminal dynasty. The transformation felt surreal, like waking up from a dream to find that the nightmare had been real and the fairy tale was the illusion. Benedetti had insisted on flying back with me, claiming he wanted to coordinate with American prosecutors, but really I suspected because he was enjoying the case too much to miss any of the final acts. During the 8-hour flight, he briefed me on what to expect in the coming weeks. The media attention will be intense, he warned over champagne and first-class seats I'd paid for with my own money rather than Caldwell connections. Your husband's perp walk at Logan Airport will be front-page news across the country. You'll be the woman who brought down one of Boston's most prominent families. I didn't set out to be anyone's hero, I said, watching clouds drift past the airplane window. I just wanted to survive. Sometimes survival requires heroism, he replied, and sometimes heroes are just people who refuse to let evil triumph over them. The plane touched down at Logan just after sunset, and I could see news vans lined up outside the terminal even before we taxied to the gate. Someone had leaked my flight information, and the feeding frenzy was already beginning. Sarah met me at baggage claim with a security escort and an expression that mixed relief with barely contained excitement. Anna, thank God you're back. It's been absolute chaos here, but good chaos. We've had to hire 3 temporary assistants just to handle the phone calls. As we made our way through the airport, reporters shouted questions and camera flashes created a strobe effect that would have been overwhelming if I hadn't been running on pure adrenaline. Ms. Morgan, how did you discover your husband's crimes? What was it like living with a criminal? Are you planning to write a book about this? I kept walking my head high, offering no comments, but projecting the confidence I'd learned during my years in the Caldwell world. Let them see that I wasn't broken, wasn't hiding, wasn't ashamed. I was the woman who'd outmaneuvered one of Boston's most powerful families, and I wanted that strength to be the story they told. The ride to my Back Bay penthouse felt like returning to a crime scene. Every street corner held memories of the life I'd built with Sean, the restaurants where we'd celebrated milestones, the shops where I'd bought clothes to fit into his world, the very sidewalks where I'd walked as Mrs. Sean Caldwell, believing I was living a love story when I was actually trapped in a con game. We've had the locks changed and the security system upgraded, Sarah informed me as our car pulled up to the building. Also, there have been some interesting developments with your business accounts. What kind of developments? The kind where major corporations are suddenly very interested in working with someone who's proven she has integrity, she said with a grin. The Fairmont contract is just the beginning. 3 other hotel chains have reached out, plus 2 major tech companies, a pharmaceutical firm, and the Boston Symphony Orchestra wants to discuss making you their exclusive event coordinator. Cupcakes. As we rode the elevator up to the penthouse, I felt a strange disconnection from the woman who'd lived here before Rome, that Anna had been so desperate for acceptance, so willing to compromise her values for the sake of belonging. This Anna understood that belonging to the wrong group was worse than standing alone. The apartment looked exactly the same, but felt completely different. Sean's presence had been erased not through any physical changes, but through the knowledge of who he really was. The expensive furniture we'd chosen together, the art we'd collected, the kitchen where we'd hosted dinner parties for his criminal associates. It all felt like props from a play I'd unknowingly been performing in. I can stay tonight if you want, Sarah offered, clearly recognizing my emotional state, or we can arrange for someone else to be here. No, I said, setting down my luggage in the foyer. I need to face this alone. She left reluctantly, promising to return first thing in the morning with coffee and a detailed briefing on everything that had happened while I was gone. When the door closed behind her, I was finally alone with the wreckage of my old life and the possibilities of whatever came next. I poured myself a glass of wine from a bottle Sean had been saving for a special occasion, some expensive Bordeaux he'd planned to open when he got promoted to head of European operations. The irony was delicious. Instead of celebrating his criminal success, I was toasting his downfall. My phone rang, and I was surprised to see my father's number. Dad. Hey, sweetheart. Just wanted to make sure you made it home safe. Saw the news coverage at the airport. The warmth in his voice almost broke the composure I'd maintained throughout the day. I'm okay, Dad. Tired, but okay. Your mother and I were proud of you, you know. What you did standing up to those people, it took real courage. I was scared the whole time, I admitted, sinking onto the couch where Sean and I had once planned our future together. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared, honey. It means you do what's right even when you are scared. After we hung up, I walked through the apartment, really looking at it for the first time in years. So much of what I'd thought was ours had actually been chosen by Eleanor or influenced by Sean's preferences. The color scheme, the furniture arrangement, even the books on the shelves reflected their tastes more than mine. Tomorrow I decided I would start making this space truly mine, but tonight I needed to process what had really happened and what it meant for my future. The first few weeks back in Boston were a whirlwind of legal depositions, media interviews, and business meetings that would have been unimaginable before Rome. I testified before a federal grand jury, providing evidence that helped secure additional indictments against Eleanor Shawn and 3 other family members. The recordings Vanessa had provided proved devastating, and prosecutors were confident they had enough evidence for convictions that would put the family away for decades. But it was the civil litigation that proved most satisfying. Benedetti had filed lawsuits on my behalf, seeking damages for fraud, conspiracy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and a dozen other causes of action. The Caldwell family's assets were frozen, their properties seized, their business empire systematically dismantled by federal authorities. They're trying to negotiate a settlement, Benedetti informed me during one of our weekly strategy meetings. Through intermediaries, of course, since direct contact would violate the restraining order. What kind of settlement? The kind that would make you independently wealthy for the rest of your life, he said with satisfaction. $50 million plus your legal fees in exchange for agreeing not to pursue additional civil claims. $50 million. It was more money than I'd ever imagined, having enough to live any life I wanted without ever worrying about financial security again. But accepting it would mean letting them buy their way out of full accountability, and I wasn't sure I was ready to do that. What do you recommend, Pa? Take it, Wa, he said without hesitation. Anna, I know you want them to pay for what they did to you, but the reality is that no amount of money will undo the past 3 years. This settlement gives you the freedom to build whatever future you want, completely independent of their influence. He was right, of course. The money would give me options I'd never had before: the ability to expand my business globally, to take on projects that mattered to me rather than just profitable ones, to create something lasting and meaningful. But there was another consideration that weighed heavily on my decision. The Caldwells had hurt more people than just me. Their crimes had cost taxpayers millions in evaded taxes, cheated suppliers and contractors out of legitimate payments, and corrupted public officials whose job was to protect the public interest. A financial settlement with me wouldn't address any of that broader harm. I want to think about it, I told him. The answer came to me a week later during what should have been a routine business meeting. I was sitting in the offices of Morrison Foundation discussing their annual gala when the executive director mentioned something that stopped me cold. We're particularly excited to work with you, she said, because of how you handled the Caldwell situation. It takes real character to do what you did, to choose justice over personal comfort. Character. The word echoed in my mind for the rest of the day. I thought about the woman I'd been when I married Sean, so eager to please, so willing to compromise my values for the sake of fitting in. That woman might have taken the settlement money and disappeared, grateful to escape with her freedom and financial security. But I wasn't that woman anymore. The missing chair had forced me to confront who I really was beneath all the carefully constructed facades, and what I discovered was someone with the strength to stand up for what was right, even when it cost her everything. I called Benedetti that evening with my decision. Reject the settlement offer, I said. I want them to face the full consequences of their actions. Anna, are you certain this is a lot of money to walk away from? I'm not walking away from anything, I replied. I'm walking towards something better, a life where I don't have to compromise my principles for financial security. The rejection of their settlement offer sent shockwaves through Boston's legal and social communities. Most people couldn't understand why anyone would turn down $50 million, but I found that the people whose opinions mattered to me, my parents, my true friends, the clients who'd stuck with me through everything, respected the decision. More importantly, it freed me to focus on building the future I actually wanted, rather than just escaping the past I was trying to forget. Pinnacle Events expanded rapidly over the following months. We moved to larger offices in the financial district, hired a dozen new employees, and opened satellite locations in New York and Washington, D.C. The Fairmont contract led to partnerships with other major hotel chains, and soon we were coordinating events across the country for Fortune 500 companies, nonprofit organizations, and high-profile individuals who valued discretion and excellence. But the most satisfying part wasn't the business success, it was the culture we built. Unlike the fear-based environment at Caldwell Hospitality, Pinnacle Events became known for treating employees well, paying fair wages, and maintaining absolute ethical standards. We turned down clients who wanted us to cut corners or engage in questionable practices, even when it meant losing significant revenue. The criminal trials began 8 months after the arrests in Rome. I testified for 3 days, walking the jury through the evidence I'd gathered and the timeline of discoveries that had led to the exposure of the family's crimes. Sitting in that federal courtroom looking across at Eleanor and Sean in their orange jumpsuits, I felt a profound sense of closure. Eleanor had aged dramatically during her months in prison. The imperious woman who'd once dismissed me as beneath her notice now looked small and frail, her perfectly coiffed hair replaced by a gray ponytail, her designer clothing exchanged for standard issue prison attire. When our eyes met during my testimony, I saw not anger or hatred, but something like resignation. Sean was harder to read. He'd maintained his physical appearance better, but there was a hollowness in his eyes that suggested the reality of his situation had finally penetrated his bubble of privilege and entitlement. During cross-examination, his attorney tried to suggest that I'd been a willing participant in the family's crimes, but the evidence was too overwhelming and my testimony too compelling for the strategy to gain any traction. The verdicts came down on a Tuesday afternoon in March, almost exactly 1 year after that dinner in Rome. Eleanor was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Sean received 18 years. Marcus got 15 and Victoria 12. Their sentences ensured they would spend the rest of their productive years behind bars, their fortune seized, their reputation destroyed beyond repair. I wasn't in the courtroom when the sentences were announced. Instead, I was in my office meeting with the board of directors of a major children's charity that wanted to discuss a multi-year partnership. When Sarah knocked on my door to deliver the news, I felt not triumph, but a quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served not just for me, but for all the people they'd harmed over the years. That evening, I had dinner with my parents at their house in South Boston, the same kitchen table where I'd done homework as a child and dreamed of building something meaningful with my life. The circle felt complete, somehow returning to my roots after a journey that had taken me through wealth and betrayal and ultimately back to the values they'd taught me. "What now?" my mother asked as we shared dessert and coffee. "You've built this amazing business, you've seen justice done. What's next for Anna Morgan?" It was a good question. For so long, my energy had been focused on survival, then revenge, then building something stable and independent. Now, with those goals achieved, I had the luxury of thinking about what I actually wanted rather than what I needed to escape. I think, s- I said slowly, it's time to focus on living rather than just surviving. 6 months later, I was back in Rome, but this time as a tourist rather than a fugitive from my own life. I'd closed the biggest deal in Pinnacle Events history, coordinating a week-long global summit for an international development organization, and decided to treat myself to a real vacation. I stayed at a small boutique hotel near the Pantheon, far from the luxury establishments where the Caldwell family had once held court. My days were spent wandering through museums and markets, eating at family-owned trattorias, and rediscovering the joy of being alone with my thoughts in a beautiful place. On my last evening, I found myself at the same cafe near the Pantheon where I'd sat that first night after walking out of the restaurant. The waiter remembered me commenting on how different I looked, how much happier I seemed. He was right. The woman who'd sat at this table a year ago had been wounded, angry, focused entirely on destruction. The woman who sat here now was healed, confident, and ready to build something beautiful. As the sun set over the eternal city, I raised my glass of wine in a toast to the missing chair that had changed everything. Eleanor had intended that empty seat to humiliate me, to make me feel unwanted and out of place. Instead, it had freed me to discover who I really was when I wasn't trying to fit into someone else's vision of my life. The chair had been missing because I didn't belong at their table, but I didn't need their table. I'd built my own, and it was better than anything they could have offered. I thought about Sean, spending his days in a federal prison cell, probably still believing that his only mistake had been underestimating me. I thought about Eleanor, learning too late that cruelty has consequences, and that the people you dismiss as beneath your notice might be the very ones who bring about your downfall. But mostly I thought about the future, about the company I'd built and the good it was doing in the world, about the relationships I was forming based on honesty and mutual respect rather than manipulation and social climbing, about the woman I'd become through fire and loss and the determination to never again let anyone make me feel less than worthy. The missing chair had been meant to put me in my place. Instead, it had shown me that my place was wherever I chose to make it, at a table of my own creation, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than who they thought I should be. As I walked back through the Roman streets that night, past couples sharing gelato and families gathering for dinner, I felt a contentment I'd never experienced during my years as Mrs. Sean Caldwell. I was Anna Morgan again, but stronger and wiser than before, carrying the scars of betrayal, but also the knowledge that I could survive anything and build something beautiful from the ashes. The story that had begun with humiliation and betrayal had become one of resilience and redemption. And the best part was that it was my story written by my choices, controlled by my decisions, with an ending that belonged entirely to me. The missing chair had set me free, and I intended to make the most of that freedom for the rest of my life. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in October, 18 months after the verdicts. I was in my corner office overlooking Boston Harbor, reviewing proposals for a New Year's Eve celebration that would span 3 cities simultaneously when Sarah knocked and entered with an expression I'd learned to recognize as significant news. "Anna, there's someone on line 1 who says she's calling about Eleanor Caldwell. She won't give her name, but she insists it's urgent and that you'll want to hear what she has to say." I stared at the blinking light on my phone. In the months since the trials ended, I'd managed to build a life where the Caldwell name rarely intruded on my daily thoughts. My business was thriving beyond anything I'd imagined possible. I'd started dating someone who knew nothing about my past except what he'd read in the papers, and I'd even begun sleeping through the night without the nightmares that had plagued me for years. Did she say what it was about? Something about Eleanor wanting to see you. The caller said it was important for your closure, whatever that means. I almost told Sarah to take a message and forget about it. Whatever Eleanor wanted, whatever game she was trying to play from her federal prison cell, I had no interest in participating. But something in the mysterious caller's insistence nagged at me. Put her through, I decided. The voice that came through the speaker was older, refined with the kind of Boston Brahmin accent that suggested old money and older social connections. "Ms. Morgan, my name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm calling on behalf of Eleanor Caldwell, though I should clarify that this call is not officially sanctioned by prison authorities." Margaret Whitmore. The name was familiar, and after a moment I placed it. She'd been Eleanor's closest friend, part of the inner circle of society women who'd treated me like an intruder at their charitable functions and country club gatherings. "What does Eleanor want?" I asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "She's dying, Ms. Morgan. Pancreatic cancer diagnosed 3 months ago. The doctors give her perhaps 6 weeks." I felt a complicated surge of emotions. Satisfaction that justice was taking an even more final form than prison, sadness for anyone facing such a diagnosis, and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and was surprised to find I meant it. "But I'm not sure why you're calling me." "Because she's asked to see you. Before she dies, she wants to speak with you privately. She says there are things you need to know, things that weren't revealed during the trials. More secrets, more revelations." Part of me wanted to hang up immediately and pretend this conversation had never happened. I'd fought so hard to move beyond the Caldwell family's toxic influence, and here they were trying to pull me back in even from a prison deathbed. "What kind of things?" I found myself asking despite my better judgment. She wouldn't tell me the details. She said it was something that would help you understand why she did what she did and that you deserve to know the truth before she dies. The truth? Mrs. Whitmore, the truth is that Eleanor Caldwell and her family are criminals who tried to destroy my life to cover their own crimes. That truth was established in federal court. I understand your anger, dear, but Eleanor is genuinely remorseful about what happened to you. She spent these months in prison thinking about nothing else. Remorseful. Eleanor Caldwell expressing remorse. It seemed as unlikely as the sun rising in the west. Even if that's true, I said, I'm not sure what good it would do for either of us to have that conversation. She said to tell you that it has to do with your parents. The words hit me like a physical blow. What about my parents? That's all she would say. Miss Morgan, I know this is difficult, but she's an old woman facing death, and she believes this information is important for your peace of mind. After Margaret Whitmore hung up, I sat in my office staring out at the harbor, watching ferries shuttle back and forth between the city and the islands. My parents had been kept carefully separate from the Caldwell drama, protected by geography and their own lack of interest in high society. What could Eleanor possibly know about them that she thought I needed to hear? I called them that evening, casually asking about their health, their finances, anything that might give me a clue about what Eleanor could be referring to. But my father sounded fine talking about a project he was working on at the garage, and my mother was excited about a new book club she'd joined. Whatever Eleanor's secret was, it didn't seem to be affecting their daily lives. Still, the call haunted me. 3 days later, I found myself driving to the Federal Correctional Facility in Danbury, Connecticut, where Eleanor was serving her sentence. I told myself I was going for closure to finally put this chapter of my life completely behind me, but as I went through the security procedures and waited in the sterile visiting room, I wondered if I was making a terrible mistake. Eleanor looked like a ghost of her former self. The woman who'd once commanded every room she entered now seemed to have shrunk inside her orange prison uniform. Her silver hair, once perfectly styled, hung limp around a face that had aged a decade in 18 months, but her eyes were still sharp, still calculating even in the face of terminal illness. Anna, she said as I sat down across from her at the metal table, I wasn't sure you'd come. I almost didn't, I replied honestly. I'm only here because Margaret said you had information about my parents. She nodded slowly. Always direct. I suppose I should have appreciated that quality more when you were part of our family. I was never part of your family, Eleanor. We both know that. No, she agreed quietly. You weren't, and that was my greatest mistake. The admission was so unexpected that I found myself studying her face for signs of manipulation. But what I saw there was something I'd never encountered in Eleanor Caldwell before: genuine vulnerability. You said you had information about my parents, I prompted. I do, but first I owe you an explanation about why everything happened the way it did, about why I treated you so badly from the beginning. You treated me badly because I wasn't good enough for your precious son, because I was working class and you thought I was beneath your family. That's what I let you believe, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But it wasn't the real reason. She paused, seeming to gather strength for whatever she was about to reveal. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight I'd never heard from her before. I treated you badly because I was terrified of you. From the moment Sean brought you home, I knew you were going to destroy us. I stared at her. That makes no sense. I was completely naive about your business operations. I wasn't a threat to anyone. You were the biggest threat we'd ever faced, and you didn't even know it. Eleanor's hands were shaking slightly as she spoke. Anna, you have to understand something about our family. We've been criminals for generations, not just Sean and Marcus and me, but my father, his father before him. The Caldwell fortune was built on corruption, and maintaining it required a very specific kind of person. What kind of person? Someone who would either participate willingly or could be controlled through fear and manipulation. Sean's previous girlfriends, Vanessa included, they all understood the game. They knew what they were getting into and were willing to be part of it in exchange for the lifestyle it provided. She took a shaky breath before continuing. But you were different. You had your own moral compass, your own sense of right and wrong that couldn't be bought or intimidated. When you started asking questions about our business dealings, when you showed genuine interest in understanding how our money was made, I knew it was only a matter of time before you figured out the truth. So you decided to destroy me first. I decided to protect my family the only way I knew how, by getting rid of the threat you represented. The conversation was taking a surreal turn. Eleanor was essentially admitting that she'd recognized my integrity before I'd even known I possessed it. That still doesn't explain what this has to do with my parents, I said. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the metal table. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with something that might have been shame. Your father, Tom Morgan, he worked on my father's cars back in the 1990s. I felt the blood drain from my face. What? My father, Charles Caldwell, owned a fleet of luxury vehicles that required specialized maintenance. Your father was one of the few mechanics in Boston who could work on them properly. He did excellent work, always honest, always reliable. My mind was reeling. My father had never mentioned working for the Caldwell family. In fact, I was certain he'd never even heard their name before I married Sean. That's impossible. Dad would have told me if he'd worked for your family. He doesn't know it was our family, Eleanor said quietly. The cars were registered under various shell company names. Your father thought he was working for different clients, but they were all my father's vehicles. I still don't understand why this matters. Eleanor took another shaky breath. Because one day in 1994, your father discovered something he wasn't supposed to see. She went on to explain that my father had been working on a particular car when he'd found a hidden compartment containing documents that detailed money laundering operations and bribery schemes. Being an honest man, he'd brought the documents to the attention of the man he thought owned the car, not realizing he was actually reporting the discovery to Charles Caldwell himself. My father was furious, Eleanor continued. Here was this working-class mechanic who'd stumbled onto evidence that could destroy our entire operation. He wanted to have your father killed. The words hit me like a physical blow. Killed. It was seriously discussed. My father had people killed for far less than what your father had discovered, but I convinced him there was a better way. Eleanor explained that she'd researched my father's background and discovered that he had a young daughter, me, who was exceptionally bright and showed promise of getting into college despite the family's limited financial means. I suggested that rather than killing your father, we should help him, anonymously, of course, a series of what would appear to be lucky breaks that would improve his family's situation and ensure his daughter got the education she deserved. What kind of help? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I knew the answer. The promotion your father received at the garage where he worked, that was arranged by us. The scholarship you received for business school, we funded that too through a charitable foundation we controlled. Even the loan your parents got to pay off their mortgage early that came from one of our shell companies at an interest rate so low, it was essentially a gift. I felt sick. Everything I'd achieved, everything I'd built my life on had been tainted by Caldwell money from the beginning. Why? I whispered. Because it was safer than killing him and it bought his silence. Your father never spoke about what he'd found because he assumed it was just a misunderstanding, and his life improved so dramatically afterward that he had no reason to look back. But why help me specifically? Eleanor's expression became even more pained. Because I had a daughter once. She died when she was 7, leukemia. Watching your father work so hard to give you opportunities reminded me of what I'd lost. Helping you felt like a way of honoring her memory. The revelation left me stunned. In all the years I'd known Eleanor, she'd never mentioned having a daughter who died, but it explained so much about her behavior, her need for control, her fierce protection of the family name. So when Sean brought me home, I said slowly, you recognized me. Immediately. the daughter of Tom Morgan, the mechanic, who'd once held our family's fate in his hands without even knowing it. The girl we'd helped educate, who'd built herself into exactly the kind of person who could destroy us. And you saw it as a threat. The ultimate threat. Here was someone we'd inadvertently created, someone with the intelligence and moral courage to bring us down walking into our home as my son's fiancée. It was like watching a time bomb walk through our front door. Eleanor went on to explain that she'd initially hoped to control me the way they'd controlled others, through a combination of wealth and intimidation. When that failed, when I'd started asking uncomfortable questions and showing signs of independence, the plan to frame me had been born. We thought if we could destroy you completely, discredit you so thoroughly that no one would believe anything you said, then we'd be safe. Even if you'd figured out some of our operations, who would listen to a convicted felon. But you underestimated me. Catastrophically. We created our own nemesis and then invited her into our home. Eleanor almost smiled, a weak expression that contained more irony than humor. My father would have found it amusing if it hadn't destroyed everything he built. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of these revelations settling between us. Everything I'd believed about my own story, my own success, had been built on a foundation I'd never known existed. Why are you telling me this now? I finally asked. Because you deserve to know the truth. And because I'm hoping you'll forgive me before I die. Forgive you. The request was so audacious that I almost laughed. Eleanor, you tried to send me to federal prison for crimes I didn't commit. You destroyed my marriage, my trust in people, my sense of security. Why would I forgive you? Because carrying hatred is poisonous, she said simply. I've spent 18 months in this place learning that lesson. The anger and fear that drove me to treat you so badly, it poisoned everything it touched. I don't want you to carry that same poison for the rest of your life. I'm not carrying hatred, I said. I've moved on, built a life I'm proud of. Have you really? Eleanor's eyes, still sharp despite her illness, studied my face. Or have you just built higher walls to protect yourself from being hurt again? The question hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. Yes, I'd built a successful business and was even dating someone new, but Eleanor was right about the walls. I'd become expert at keeping people at a safe distance, never fully trusting, never fully opening myself to the possibility of being vulnerable again. What my family did to you was unforgivable, Eleanor continued. But if you let it make you incapable of trust, incapable of love, then we've stolen more from you than just 3 years of your life. We've stolen your future happiness. I'm perfectly happy, I insisted, but even as I said the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. Are you? Or are you just safe? Before I could answer, a guard announced that visiting time was over. Eleanor struggled to stand her illness, making the simple movement difficult. There's one more thing, she said as the guard approached. The money we spent helping your family over the years, the scholarship, the loans, your father's promotion, I want you to know that it wasn't dirty money. It came from legitimate investments, clean sources. Your education, your parents' improved circumstances, those weren't built on crime. Does it matter? I asked. I hope so. I hope it means you can keep the good things that came from our intervention without feeling tainted by how they originated. As I drove back to Boston that evening, my mind churned through everything Eleanor had revealed. The conversation had upended my understanding of my own history, forced me to confront uncomfortable questions about success and merit and the complex ways that lives intersect without people even realizing it. But more than that, it had forced me to examine the life I'd built since Rome. Eleanor's question about whether I was happy or just safe echoed in my mind. The truth was that I'd become incredibly good at protecting myself, at maintaining control, at ensuring I'd never again be vulnerable to the kind of betrayal I'd experienced with Sean. But in building those protections, had I also built a prison? I thought about David, the man I'd been dating for 6 months. He was kind, successful, completely different from Sean in every way that mattered. but I'd kept him at arm's length, never fully letting him into my emotional life, never allowing myself to be completely vulnerable with him. When he'd suggested moving in together, I'd deflected. When he'd talked about future plans, I'd changed the subject. I was safe. But was I happy? The question haunted me for days. I found myself going through the motions of my successful life while grappling with the possibility that Eleanor, even dying in a federal prison, had managed to identify a truth about me that I'd been refusing to see. A week after the prison visit, I called David and asked him to dinner. We went to a small restaurant in the North End, the kind of intimate place I'd previously avoided because it felt too much like the kind of spot where serious conversations happened. "I need to tell you something," I said after we'd ordered, "about why I've been holding back with you." He reached across the table and took my hand. "Anna, you don't owe me any explanations. I know you've been through something traumatic, and I'm willing to wait as long as it takes for you to feel comfortable opening up." His patience and understanding were exactly what made him so different from Sean, and exactly what made me realize I'd been doing him a disservice by not trusting him with the whole truth about who I was and where I'd come from. So I told him everything, not just the public story that had been in the newspapers, but the private pain, the ongoing struggle to trust the conversation with Eleanor that had forced me to confront how much I was still letting the Caldwell family control my life by making me afraid to be vulnerable. I've been so focused on protecting myself from being hurt again, I concluded, that I haven't been living fully, and that's not fair to you, and it's not the life I want for myself. David listened without interrupting, his expression growing more understanding with each revelation. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you for trusting me with this," he said finally. "And for what it's worth, I think you're one of the bravest people I've ever met, not just for what you did to expose their crimes, but for being willing to examine your own life honestly and make changes." "I'm not sure I'm brave," I said. "I think I'm just tired of being afraid. Sometimes that's the same thing." Over the following months, I began deliberately dismantling the emotional walls I'd built. I introduced David to my parents, shared more about my business challenges and successes, allowed him to see me when I was vulnerable or uncertain, rather than always projecting strength and control. It was terrifying at first. Every time I opened up, every time I let him see a part of me that could be hurt, I felt exposed in ways that triggered memories of my marriage to Sean. But David proved over and over that he could be trusted with my vulnerability, that love didn't have to be a weapon used to control or manipulate. 6 months later, he proposed during a weekend trip to Rome. We were sitting at the same cafe near the Pantheon where I'd first begun to reclaim my life, and when he got down on one knee, I realized that the city that had once been the site of my destruction had become the place where I'd learned to hope again. "Yes," I said, without hesitation, surprising myself with how certain I felt. "Yes, absolutely yes." As he slipped the ring onto my finger, I thought about Eleanor, who had died 3 months earlier in her prison hospital bed. Her funeral had been a small private affair that I hadn't attended, but I'd sent flowers with a note that simply said, "Thank you for helping me understand that forgiveness isn't about forgetting, it's about choosing not to let the past control the future." The missing chair that had started this entire journey had been meant to put me in my place, to make me feel unwanted and out of place. Instead, it had taught me that I didn't need anyone's permission to claim my seat at the table of life. But more than that, it had eventually led me to understand that the most important table wasn't one where I sat alone in defiant independence, but one where I chose to share space with people who valued and respected me. Eleanor's final gift hadn't been information about my parents or revelations about our connected histories. It had been the challenge to examine whether I was truly living or just surviving, whether I was building a life or just building defenses. As David and I walked through the ancient streets of Rome that night, planning our future together, I realized that the missing chair had ultimately been the greatest gift anyone had ever given me. not because it led to revenge or justice or financial success, but because it forced me to discover who I really was when everything else was stripped away. And who I was, it turned out, was someone capable of love and trust and vulnerability, someone strong enough to build something beautiful from the ruins of betrayal, someone worthy of a place at any table she chose to join. The chair had been missing because I didn't belong at their table, but I'd built my own table now, and it was exactly where I belonged.